This episode is brought to you by Microsoft Azure. Turn your ideas into reality with an Azure free account. Get everything you need to develop apps across cloud and hybrid environments, scale workloads, create cloud-connected mobile experiences, and so much more. Discover what you can create with popular services free for 12 months. Learn more at azure.com. That's AZURE.com. And sign up for a free account to start building in the cloud today.
Hi friends, if you're enjoying this series and you'd like to help me reach even more people with thinking faith, please consider supporting the show. Silver supporters get early access to episodes and bonus content. Gold supporters also get signed books and a monthly catch-up with me. The links to support are with the show notes or visit justinbrierley.com. Enjoy today's episode. So Richard and Francis, welcome along to the programme.
Thanks, Justin.
Thank you.
It was happening. The game was afoot. In 2022, Richard Dawkins, one of the most prominent atheists of the 21st century, agreed to appear on the show I was then hosting, The Big Conversation from Premier Unbelievable. Despite some fleeting appearances in the past, I had never had the opportunity to bring the famed biologist on for a proper interaction on science and faith. Until now.
I'm really privileged to have you both on the same call and to be able to do this with you. It's been a real dream come true bringing you together. So thank you both for being here.
This time, he would be talking about his area of expertise in a long-form conversation on biology and belief with another star of the scientific world, Francis Collins. Collins is every bit the equal of Dawkins when it comes to biology. A famed geneticist, he led the Human Genome Project, which first sequenced the DNA of the entire human body. However, whereas Dawkins is the world's preeminent atheist, Collins is a committed Christian. Anyone expecting an explosive debate between the two would have been disappointed. Their mutual respect for each other as fellow scientists shone through. Perhaps the mutual respect also stemmed from the fact that Collins had become a friend and confidant of another of the horsemen of the new atheism, Christopher Hitchens, before his death in 2011.
Well, I got to know Hitch before his illness. We were involved, as you might imagine, on opposite sides of this question about whether one can be a scientist and a believer in God. But we became friends, and I would go and drop by his apartment, and we would drink wine, and he would drink scotch, and we would discuss everything from faith to George Orwell to Thomas Jefferson to whatever else was on his mind. And then he got sick, and he was suddenly diagnosed with already very advanced esophageal cancer. And I was glad to try to help to see if there was something that could buy some time. And I think we did buy him some time, actually with some genomic analysis. And perhaps he was with us for an extra 6 or 9 months.
I was aware, Francis, of what you were doing for him, and on behalf of people, as it were, on my side of the aisle, we felt very grateful to you for what you were doing.
The conversation between Dawkins and Collins ran the full gamut of questions on science and faith, whether evolution can be reconciled with Genesis, why God allows suffering, how we developed our moral instincts, and whether a scientist can countenance the idea of miracles. To a large degree, they agreed on the biological questions, but it was when they reached the biggest questions of cosmic purpose that the most fundamental differences between the two scientists emerged.
But you said that, it's happened just because of the laws of physics. I want to take this back to that step. Where did those come from?
Well, let's get to that then, because you keep getting to that, and that I believe that's a very profound. If somebody was going to convince me of the need for a God, it would be there.
I was bowled over to hear Dawkins describe anything as a good argument for God, and even more so by his even-handed summary of the fine-tuning of the universe that many people believe points to a cosmic designer.
The physical constants, things like the speed of light, gravitational constant, and strong and weak force and things, most physicists agree, that if you change any of those constants by even a very, very small amount, then we don't come into existence. The universe doesn't come into existence. They have to be like that in order for galaxies to form, for stars to form, for chemistry to form, actually. The prerequisite for life to evolve needs that as well. So that's the nearest approach to a good argument. You might convince somebody like me to be a deist, but then you suddenly say, okay, well, because of...
he's converted. Did you hear that? Here.
Of course, the joke we shared was that Dawkins had not been convinced to believe, but this was at least the new atheist speaking in a remarkably open-minded posture, spelling out the nature of our Goldilocks universe. Just as Goldilocks needed her porridge, seating and bed to be not too hot or cold, large or small, but just right for her, so our universe seems to be perfectly, almost miraculously suited in its fundamental physics to enable life to develop within it, something we'll dive into in more detail later on in today's show. But the part of this conversation that left the biggest impression on me was that Dawkins quite honestly acknowledged that the reason he wasn't convinced by the God explanation for the fact we live in a Goldilocks universe was based more on his personal preferences than a purely scientific or rational response.
Well, I was going to say, is the issue fundamentally, Richard, that you'll never be satisfied with an immaterial explanation? You'll always be, as a scientist in a sense, and as a materialist, let's face it, you're not going to be satisfied with anything but a material explanation for the material universe we live in.
That's part of it. I suppose perhaps we both come at it from with a bit of emotional. Not emotional is the wrong word. A bit of presupposition. As somebody who's deeply steeped in evolution, I am kind of in love with the idea that it's possible to explain complex things in terms of simple things. Darwin's great gift to us, I think, is to show that big complex things can come into existence by an explicable, understandable, beautiful, elegant process of gradual evolutionary change. And that's such a beautiful idea. Inventing a big complex thing, which God must be if he exists, throws a ruddy great spanner in the whole works.
You almost sound, Richard, that you would be disappointed ultimately if that was the explanation. You would prefer that there be a sort of Darwinian explanation of the universe itself. That's sort of where your mind goes. You don't like the idea that there's actually is some kind of a mind behind it.
Yeah, that's a fair summary of what I just said.
Whether God is a clunky and complex explanation in the way Dawkins envisages is highly questionable, and something we'll also dive into later on in today's episode. But I was intrigued at Dawkins' core reason for rejecting God, that he doesn't like that kind of explanation. He hesitated to label his feeling as emotional, but however much we think of ourselves as rational, evidence-based thinkers, I believe our personal preferences do come into play when we consider what we're willing to countenance as an explanation. Dawkins prefers the idea of a universe that runs according to blind laws and processes, and doesn't like the idea of a mind behind it all. So he's holding out for a Darwinian explanation of our fine-tuned cosmos. The reason Dawkins rose to such prominence as a science popularizer in the first place is because he has a poetic way with words. There's an oft-quoted passage of his in his 1995 book, River Out of Eden, which pithily summarizes his view of reality.
The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference.
But what if the universe we observe is not the one that Richard Dawkins has just described? What if, with the advance of science, cosmology and physics in the past 30 years or more, we are, quite remarkably, witnessing in our generation the rebirth of belief in a universe which, far from being blind, pitiless and indifferent, is actually teeming with design, purpose and evidence for a mind behind it all? I'm Justin Brierley, and throughout my working life, I've been hosting conversations on faith between atheists, agnostics, and believers. In this documentary series, I'm telling the story of why new atheism grew old and secular thinkers are considering Christianity again. I'm speaking to those inside and outside the atheist movement and the many new thinkers beginning a new conversation on the value of faith. Along the way, we'll meet some of those who have found themselves surprised by God as they've made the journey from atheism to Christianity. Welcome to the surprising rebirth of belief in God, episode 19, A Goldilocks Universe, the surprising science pointing to God. Well, just before we get into the rest of today's show, someone we've heard from quite a bit on the podcast is author and speaker Glenn Scrivener. Hello, Glenn.
Hey, Justin. Always great to be here.
Well, for a while now, you've been happily pointing people to your online course 321. Where did that come from?
It's a passion of mine to help people get to grips with Christian faith and to do it in a way that's attractive and imaginative and deep and that assumes no prior knowledge. So 321 is my way of showing life according to Jesus. We want it to be like a mere Christianity for a digital age.
Okay, so that sounds like it's maybe more for those who are not Christians?
Well, yeah, many people have done it who are not Christians, and they've found faith for the first time. We're thrilled about that. But like with Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, Christians love that book too. And the first audience we have in mind for 321 is actually a Christian who wants to be refreshed in their faith and to have something to pass on to their Christian curious friends and family.
Okay, so Christian or not, this basically gets people to the heart of the faith.
Right, and nearly 10,000 people have joined the online platform. It's free. You watch these video-led sessions and you think through the stunning animations, you engage with the chat community, you get a ton of extra content thrown in, and now you have on your phone a Mere Christianity that you can share with others. So the phrase we're using is, you can share this without shame, without cost, and without delay.
Well, we've been really enjoying promoting 321, and listeners to this podcast can get into it instantly by going to 321course.com/JB. That's 321course.com/JB. Thanks, Glenn.
Thank you, Justin. Keep up the good work.
Allumage and start.
Donc, mise à feu du
Allumage
moteur.
UAP, décollage.
Décollage, liftoff from a tropical rainforest to the edge of time itself. James Webb begins a voyage back to the birth of the universe.
The largest telescope ever flown launched into deep space on Christmas Day 2021. Its primary mission is to reveal the "let there be light" moment, when the stars and galaxies first ignited after the Big Bang.
The launch of the James Webb Space Telescope 3 years ago and the extraordinary images of the deep universe that it's been sending back have confirmed what scientists like well-known UK physicist Brian Cox have already known from cosmological research for many years.
You know, the Webb looks so far out that it's capturing light that's been travelling for over 13 billion years. But the universe has been expanding, and so the light has been stretching. And so for the most distant galaxies, we're looking back in time almost to the Big Bang, so that the Webb can see the formation of the first galaxies. It's essentially looking all the way back to very close to the beginning of time.
The beginning of time. That's an interesting concept, isn't it? One we'll unpack in more detail shortly. But as it stands, the further we can see into the universe, the further back we're seeing in time to the very beginning of the universe itself.
When we look at the universe as a whole, and remember I mentioned to you that astronomy is a time machine, so we can see what the universe was like.
This is Christian astrophysicist Jennifer Wiseman, who we met in a previous episode. She heads up NASA's Hubble Space Telescope program. Here she is giving me a fascinating 3-minute explanation of the past 13.8 billion years.
Of the 13.8 billion years of cosmic history, we can actually look and see what it was like back then, because we can look at these more distant galaxies and see what they looked like and what their composition was. And what we have learned is that early the first galaxies. In fact, the new Webb telescope is seeing some of these early baby galaxies. They started forming early on through conglomerations of the earliest atoms, the earliest gas. And those earliest little gas clouds produced the earliest stars, which were very simple, mostly made of hydrogen and not much else. Those stars came and went, but stars are little factories that, as they shine, they are creating heavier elements in their cores. That's through this process of fusion. And when they run out of fuel in their cores, they disperse this material that they have created into the interstellar medium, the gas, and then it gets caught up in the next generations of stars. What that means is that over time, these galaxies that are full of these stars coming and going are maturing, and we can see that. We can measure their sizes as they merge together and grow into bigger galaxies, and more importantly, their compositions get more complicated over time as their stars come and go, creating eventually what we need for planets and life in our epoch of time. So our sun and our planets around our sun is not a first generation star. It required previous generations of stars to produce the heavier stuff that enabled dust and planets to form when our star formed about 4.5 billion years ago. Our galaxy formed maybe 12 billion years ago, but our own star system only formed about 4.5 billion years ago. It's not a first generation star. I'm saying all that to say that what we can see now is this progression of the universe from this burst of inflation and energy to the transition of energy into matter, and from the development of that material to under these precise laws of physics to form gravitationally bound stars that can create heavier elements that have enabled eventually star systems with planets to form. And in at least one of those star systems, a planet that has life, and not only life, but life that over time has become more complex to the point where we are here having a conversation about how did we get here. To me, that is absolutely mind-blowing, awesome, wonderful, and it is objectively so. It isn't just that we've already anticipated this kind of thing. This is a surprise. I mean, humanity for most of history didn't know about this progressive history of the universe. Now we do, and I think that is an objective sense of awe, or that gives us a very valid response of curiosity, awe, wonder, humility, and hopefully gratitude for the fact that we are here and we understand a bit about our connection to the universe in both space and time.
It is perhaps one of the most surprising and counterintuitive ideas to have ever been proposed that our universe has not always been here. In 1927, working from Albert Einstein's theory of general relativity, which describes the structure of space and time, a young Belgian physicist priest made the revolutionary suggestion that the universe had in fact expanded over time to its present size from an infinitely small, dense, hot point.
There's a man actually called Georges Lemaitre who worked independently of Einstein, but at the same time in the early 1920s, before we even knew there were other galaxies beyond the Milky Way.
This is Brian Cox telling the story.
And they noticed that the equations suggest the universe might be stretching. And so he wrote to Einstein and said, your theory suggests there was a day without a yesterday. Because he thought if everything's expanding now, then it must have been closer together in the past. And so there might be a time when it was all together. And he was a priest.
Wow.
So he's a Belgian priest. So I think, I wrote about this, now it's kind of my interpretation of it, but I think that he was more predisposed to accept what the equations were telling him, because a beginning, an origin for a priest is really a nice thing, because it tells you the creation event.
Yeah.
And Einstein tried to dodge it and put this allowed term into his equation, which is almost the stretchy term. To say, well, if it's all kind of contracting or something, can I put something in to make it stretch a bit to balance it all out so it can be eternal? So, and you can't make it eternal that way. But he tried it. Then he took it out and called it his biggest blunder. What he'd done was miss the prediction of the Big Bang, really. So by trying to fiddle around to have a static universe that's stable, he missed what the equations were screaming. His own theory was screaming to him, which is that, no, the universe expands or contracts. And he missed it.
Little wonder that Einstein had missed the implication of his theory. Up to that point, a steady-state theory was in favour, the idea that the universe had always existed. But now this new revolutionary theory of an expanding universe had blown that apart. And it remains a bizarre concept. Everything that exists, all energy, matter and material in the universe, even time itself, if we wind the clock back to the beginning, once existed momentarily in a space the size of your bedroom. And a moment before that was the size of a basketball, and a moment before that the size of a mustard seed, and before that, well, appears to have been something akin to nothing. Yet what has come to be called Big Bang theory has now been the settled consensus in science for a long time. Further observation in the 1960s provided clear empirical evidence of the heat signature left by the early expansion of the universe. Brian Cox wondered whether Lemaitre, a Catholic priest, was tempted to use this idea of the universe apparently popping into existence to justify God. Interestingly, Lemaitre always resisted that move. Here's the late Christopher Hitchens reflecting in 2008, during one of the many New Atheist debates on God at the time, on whether the extraordinary nature of the universe points to anything divine.
Now we know there was a time when everything was inside something about the size of a baseball that's now 4,000 billion galaxies. And what my daughter wants to know is what was outside the baseball. And I don't know. But we know that much. People say, oh, well, nothing so amazing could have happened without God. So there's a name for this kind of argument. It's called unfalsifiability. It's an argument you can't beat because it isn't an argument. If you say, well, now I see how complex everything is, it would have to be God who was responsible. There's no way I can disprove that. There's no way I can falsify it. And unfalsifiability, counterintuitively, is quite rightly considered to be a test, not of the strength of an argument, but of its extreme weakness. In fact, of its non-existence as an argument.
Hitchens here, while recognising the quite remarkable nature of our universe's origins, is also spelling out a criticism that's somewhat similar to another frequent objection, that it's too easy to fill the gaps in our scientific knowledge with the God explanation, an objection which, again, we'll return to later. Nevertheless, as scientist and philosopher Stephen Meyer, author of The Return of the God Hypothesis, told me, the discovery that the universe had a beginning was a shock to those who had assumed the universe had always just been there.
Cosmology is the first place where I think it's pretty obvious that what the materialists expected to find is not what they actually ended up observing. And this has created cognitive dissonance through across now virtually a century, because the first indications that the materialist expectation was inconsistent with observations came in the 1920s, maybe even back to the teens. The standard understanding of the origin of the universe was that there had not been an origin event, that the universe was eternal and self-existing. It did not need an external creator. It had always been here, and therefore there was nothing external to it that needed to act to bring it into existence. And Einstein famously in 1931 acknowledged this. He went out to the Hubble telescope and had a look for himself with Hubble, famous newsreel footage, and then 2 weeks later gives an interview with the New York Times and acknowledges that he was wrong, that Hubble and his colleague Humison had shown that the universe was expanding. It was not static. There must be a beginning. And then we had, a century of debate about whether that initial conclusion held or not. There was the steady state universe, there was the oscillating universe, there have been attempts to get around the beginning with quantum cosmology, but eventually I think the consensus now that the universe had a beginning and that even space and time are part of what came into existence, I think is completely unexpected from a materialistic standpoint. The universe does not seem to have been eternal and self-existent. It had a beginning in the finite past. Therefore, that does raise the ultimate question of causality. What could cause matter, space, time, and energy to come into existence? And that question, I think, has re-raised the ancient considerations from the cosmological argument.
John Lennox, Emeritus Professor of Mathematics and Philosophy of Science at Oxford University, told me about the reception he remembers Big Bang theory receiving in its early days, including from eminent physicist Fred Hoyle.
Of course, Fred Hoyle coined that phrase, Big Bang. It was a label and a mystery. It was his rejection, really, and repugnance to the idea of a beginning. And part of that, his colleagues said, was he didn't really like the idea of a creator. Now, what is so interesting about that is that I remember the 1960s when the evidence came in strong and heavy that there was a beginning to space-time. It was resisted in the UK, even by the editor of Nature, who said we shouldn't go down that road because it'll give too much leverage to people who believe in creation. In other words, it raised the obvious question, if there was a beginning to space-time, and everything we know this universe proceeded from that point, it raises the question, what caused it? What lies behind it? Now, oddly enough, it was the 1960s where we had the definitive evidence came in. For centuries, it had been believed with Aristotle that the universe was eternal. But the Hebrew Bible had for centuries, and the Christian New Testament had been claiming that there was a beginning. Pushback against the idea that there was a beginning to space-time actually did come primarily from atheist scientists. And they had to give in because of the sheer weight of evidence. And so we have a beginning. It raises the question of, well, what caused that?
Despite the intransigence of some physicists like Fred Hoyle, who refused to embrace Big Bang cosmology until his death in 2001, this surprising view of the universe went on to become the consensus view in astrophysics. In time, the bright minds of physicists such as Stephen Hawking would develop singularity theorems, showing that if we wound the clock back some 13.8 billion years, we would find that the universe had a first moment when all of space, matter, and even time itself first appeared. It's not hard to see why there was pushback in secular quarters. The idea that the universe began to exist at a certain point in the past does seem to dovetail remarkably neatly with the Christian view of God creating the universe. In recent decades, Christian philosopher William Lane Craig has been the most prolific voice arguing for the theistic implications of the Big Bang. Now, fair warning, dear listener, things are going to get a little bit more technical over the next few minutes, which is perhaps unsurprising in an episode dealing with astrophysics, but we will bring things back down to earth soon. Anyway, William Lane Craig has married the evident from contemporary cosmology with a philosophical argument, first proposed by medieval scholars, that the universe cannot logically exist infinitely into the past. In short, Craig's famous Kalam cosmological argument contends that space, time, and matter coming into existence requires a first cause that transcends space, time, and matter. Here's William Lane Craig laying out his case in a public debate.
We can summarize our argument thus far as follows. Premise 1, the universe began to exist. 2, if the universe began to exist, then the universe has a transcendent cause. 3, therefore the universe has a transcendent cause. Given the truth of the two premises, the conclusion necessarily follows. Now, from the very nature of the case, this cause must be an uncaused, changeless, timeless, and immaterial being which created the universe. It must be uncaused because we've seen that there cannot be an infinite regress of causes. It must be timeless and therefore changeless, at least without the universe, because it created time. Because it also created space, it must transcend space as well, and therefore be immaterial, not physical. Now, there are only two possible candidates that could fit such a description. Either an abstract object, like a number, or an unembodied mind or consciousness. But abstract objects don't stand in causal relations. The number 7, for example, can't cause anything. Therefore, it follows that the transcendent cause of the universe is an unembodied mind. And thus we are brought not merely to an uncaused cause of the universe, but to its personal creator.
Craig's Kalam cosmological argument for God, which he says has gained support from the scientific evidence for a beginning, is one of the most referenced arguments in modern philosophy, and naturally, its theological conclusions are hotly debated. The question of whether the universe can be said to have had a beginning at all is what most divides opinions. Here's Craig in a public debate explaining why he believes the most convincing models of the universe all point to a beginning in space and time.
The Borguth-Vilenkin theorem proves that classical space-time, under a single, very general condition, cannot be extended to past infinity, but must reach a boundary at some time in the finite past. Now, either there was something on the other side of that boundary or not. If not, then that boundary is the beginning of the universe. If there was something on the other side, then it will be a non-classical region, described by the yet-to-be-discovered theory of quantum gravity. In that case, Vilenkin says, it will be the beginning of the universe.
Craig mentioned here the Borguth-Vilenkin theorem, which states that any universe which has on average been expanding must have a past space-time boundary, a real beginning. Interestingly, the framers of the theorem themselves seem to be split over its implications. While Guth denies that it necessitates a beginning of the universe, Vilenkin seems certain that it does, and Craig thinks Vilenkin is right. The person Craig was debating is eminent atheist Caltech cosmologist Sean Carroll, who maintains that there are plenty of other alternative theories that can be proposed which avoid such a beginning to physical reality.
You might also ask, could the universe be eternal, since Dr. Craig talked about this, without having a beginning at all? And again, the question is, yes, just build a model. This is my favorite model. It's actually not even a model that I think is right, once again. It's a model that I helped create. But it's about the search for models, not about saying that any one model is the right idea. We hope that someday we get there, but we don't claim that we are there yet. So whether or not the universe can be eternal does not come down to a conversation about abstract principles. It comes down to a conversation about building models and seeing which one provides the best account for what we see the universe to be doing.
We'll come back to Sean Carroll and his objections to God as an explanation of the universe in a future episode. And of course, we're only scratching the surface of a huge and complex topic here. But for now, it's worth noting that critics maintain that these alternative models of the universe, such as the ones proposed by Carroll, exist really only as mathematical models and don't satisfy the physics of our actual universe. Others have proposed arguments that our universe began as a fluctuation in a pre-existing so-called quantum vacuum, something that isn't conventionally physical at all, but more of a mathematical construct, so-called quantum cosmology. But such theories only seem to push the question back a stage. Why is there a quantum vacuum? Where do the laws that govern the quantum and classical realm of physics come from? Stephen Meyer.
Hawking himself was very worried about this. He said, what puts fire in the equations that give them a universe to describe? Even more poignantly, Alexander Vilenkin, another advocate of quantum cosmology, and says, before there was matter, space, time, and energy, what tablet were these quantum physical equations written on? Because he says mathematics in our experience is conceptual, and concepts exist in a mind, So if we're saying that the universe came out of math, essentially, are we really saying that the universe came out of a mind? So you've got the universe coming out of math, but also coming out of a math that has to be artificially constrained by an intelligence to get the right answer. It's a teleological end-directed simulation. So what you have is a mind inputting information to simulate the origin of the universe. That's what's happening in quantum cosmology. So I think actually the move to go to quantum cosmology to get around the clear evidence at the beginning just ends up adding additional weight to the theistic argument.
The cosmologists, brilliant people like the late Stephen Hawking, come in to try to explain how you can get something from nothing.
John Lennox.
This is the key philosophical question. It goes back to Leibniz and Heidegger and all kinds of other people. How do you get something for nothing? And his key statement in his penultimate book is, because there is a law like gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Now, when I read that, I thought, pardon? Is this falling for the common mistake among scientists that laws create things? C.S. Lewis debunked that long ago when pointing out that the laws of arithmetic won't create any money for you, even though some experts in the banking world thought it could. And then finally, the universe will create itself. Well, what does that mean? Just analyzing the words. If I say X creates Y, it means if you've got X, you're going to get Y, roughly speaking. If I say X creates X, well, as I said in my book, it means nonsense remains nonsense, even if high-powered scientists talk it. Now, that profoundly disturbed me. If this is the way you get rid of God, that it is intellectually unworthy. And think of Lawrence Krauss in his book, A Universe from Nothing, where he says near the beginning, he says, surely nothing must be physical, just as something is, even if it is the absence of something. Well, that's just sheer rubbish. Now, if people to get rid of God have to resort to rubbish, then using inference, the best explanation, the God explanation comes off very much more effectively. It really does worry me, that kind of non-explanation that is being foisted on people today. So there's a huge question. Hawking has not solved the question of why there's something rather than nothing. And what I want to say very carefully is, the universe came from nothing physical, but it didn't come from nothing. It came from God, who's not nothing. God may be spirit, but he isn't nothing. Yeah. And therefore, again, the biblical worldview comes in with an explanation that makes sense.
Whether you agree with John Lennox's summary or not, it seems to me, when reflecting on these sometimes complex arguments about the Big Bang, that at the very least, and to the great surprise of many atheist materialists, the most recent science of the universe has not shut down the God question. On the contrary, it has revealed a gaping mystery at the very beginning of everything. But a cosmic beginning is far from being the only extraordinary mystery that science is revealing to us. Thanks to Gareth, who wrote in to say, whether you're a person of faith, agnostic, atheist, or none of the above, this series is both genuinely thought-provoking and inspiring. I could not recommend it highly enough. Leaving a review wherever you get your podcasts or simply posting about us on your social media helps others to discover the show. If you want to follow more of my work, why not get my fortnightly newsletter? I'll even send you the first chapter of The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God book for free when you subscribe. And if you'd like to support the show, you can get early access episodes and bonus content. Gold supporters will receive signed copies of both my books. For the newsletter and to support, visit justinbrierley.com or the links with today's show.
unidentified radio source from deep space can neither be confirmed nor denied.
This is the tense theatrical trailer for the 1997 film Contact.
Mathematics is the only truly universal language, Senator. Buried within the message itself is the key to decoding it.
Those look like engineering schematics, almost like blueprints.
It is our belief that the message contains instructions for building some kind of machine.
A machine?
It might turn out to be some kind of a transport.
Transport?
Contact, starring Jodie Foster and based on the novel by Carl Sagan, was centred around a real and ongoing project, SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, in which an array of satellite receivers scan the heavens for evidence of radio signals from other worlds in our universe. Unlike the film and book, Contact hasn't happened yet. But maybe one day, among all the white noise, we will hear the telltale rhythm of a specific and complex signal that tells us we are not alone in the universe. But here's the surprising thing. I think that for quite some time, our best science has in fact been encountering some very specific and complex signals from the universe that provide very strong evidence of an intelligence from beyond.
Why is the universe just right for life? And that's the subtitle of my latest book. In Britain it's called The Goldilocks Enigma. Here it's called Cosmic Jackpot.
This is physicist and origins researcher Paul Davies giving a public lecture on a phenomenon called the fine-tuning of the universe for life.
This book is about why we seem to live in a universe that's uncannily fine-tuned for life. It looks like a fix. It looks like intelligent design. It looks like somebody, to use the words of my mentor and the person who gave me my first job, Fred Hoyle, it looks as if a super intellect has been monkeying with physics. That's the way he chose to put it. So this is amazing stuff. So what's going on here?
In his lecture, Davis goes on to explore the ways in which the advance of cosmology over the last 70 years or so has revealed that many of the fundamental constants and laws that the universe was birthed with have to be dialed to an incredibly precise set of values for life to be possible in the cosmos one day.
There's quite a long list of these apparently fortuitous accidents and coincidences in the fundamental laws of physics and the makeup of the universe that seems to have to be just right, Goldilocks-like, in order for us to be here to worry about it. Could the universe have been different? And if it could have been different, why is it as it is? Who got to choose? Why is it like this? It does seem like the universe is weirdly well suited for the emergence of life.
All of this takes us back to where we began today's show. Richard Dawkins explaining to Francis Collins that if there was one argument that might have a chance of moving him towards belief in God, it's this so-called fine-tuning of the universe for life. And it turns out his former co-horseman of the new atheism, Christopher Hitchens, felt the same way.
It's on tape, actually. A discussion between Dawkins, Dennett, Harris, and myself took place in my apartment in Washington. We talked about the encounters we'd had on the road and what had impressed us most. And I was interested to find that certainly Richard and I, this is what I remember best, both came up with the same thing, which is fine-tuning. And I was surprised to find that Richard was impressed by that too. I mean, we know what the arguments against it are. Pretty conclusive arguments, but there is something that has to impress you. I mean, the likelihood that there could be nothing is so strong, and there's actually the certainty that there will one day be nothing, which someone must also have designed, and that there was before that nothing, which was, so is that supposed to be designed as well? I don't know. But not to be impressed by the fact that we are here rather than not, it is to be too easily unimpressed, shall I say.
So what are these numbers and phenomena that must be so precise in order to allow life to exist in the cosmos? Interestingly, one of the first people to discover this phenomenon was someone we've already mentioned, Fred Hoyle. As we've heard, he was no believer in God and refused to accept the idea of a beginning of the universe in a Big Bang. But as Davis explains, even Hoyle's atheism was tested when he discovered how much our existence depends on the fine-tuning of the universe that produced us.
Here's a picture of Fred in his younger years. I won't go too much into this story, but he was very concerned about how the life-giving element, carbon, I'm sure that you know that carbon is the crucial element for life as we know it, how that life-giving element was made. It wasn't made in the Big Bang. It got made inside stars, large stars, bigger than our sun, that then exploded and spewed this carbon around the universe. And so, as romantics like to say, our bodies are made of stardust. Another way, less romantic way of looking at it, is that they're made of nuclear ash or nuclear waste. But it's the same thing, and it's absolutely crucial that the stars made this carbon and then disseminated it. But it turns out that when you look at the specific details of how the carbon got made, it looks like it couldn't happen. Fred was very puzzled by this, and then he figured that by coincidence there must be something that physicists call a resonance in the carbon atom. And a resonance just really, it's a bit like when the opera singer shatters the wine glass. It's a way of hugely amplifying a transfer of energy. And he guessed there must be, by coincidence, a resonance bang on the place where the nuclei would form carbon. When I say the place, I mean in the energy at which this reaction would take place. This is just symbolic. So carbon forms from 3 helium nuclei coming together in a resonant state and forming a carbon nucleus. So without that resonance at that position, then we wouldn't be here. And so he managed to persuade Willie Fowler, here he is, who subsequently got the Nobel Prize for this and related work, to do an experiment to see if carbon did have a resonance where Fred said it would be, and indeed it does. And so Fred was obviously very struck by this. He predicted, on the basis of his existence, that there must be this feature in a carbon nucleus, which is true, it's there, and that he realized that if the great cosmic designer had twiddled the knobs, a little bit too much one way or the other, it would go off resonance, there wouldn't be any carbon, and again, no Fred Hoyle.
And that's a kind of fine-tuning in itself, but it's actually the tip of an iceberg of a whole series of other fine-tuning parameters.
This is Stephen Meyer picking up on what happened next in the story of Hoyle's discovery of fine-tuning and invoking similar imagery to Davis.
Fine-tuning is if you could think of it as a sort of a Goldilocks zone, that we live in a Goldilocks universe where there are all these fundamental parameters that are not too heavy, not too light, the speed of light, not too fast, not too slow, the expansion rate of the universe, same, not too fast, not too slow. Everything is just right to allow for the possibility of life. That with multiple different parameters, if things fall outside very narrow ranges or tolerances, then life for various reasons would not be possible. In fact, even stable galaxies, planetary systems, and for many of the fine-tuning parameters, even atoms heavier than helium would not be possible. And so you have this kind of stunning recognition. And this hits Hoyle and other physicists at a really fundamental level because they understand how fundamental these parameters are to the universe we live in. And yet, in opposition to their expectation, the conditions that are necessary for life to exist are not common. They're not easy to produce. They're extremely improbable. They fall within narrow ranges among very much wider possible ranges, or natural ranges, as they put it. And so Hoyle ends up shifting his point of view on the big metaphysical questions from his staunch atheism to a kind of quasi-theism, and is quoted as saying, physics and chemistry look as if they've been monkeyed with, he says, to make life possible.
Further research has revealed more and more of these extraordinarily finely tuned aspects of the universe. As Meyer and others have explained, on the basis of the numbers involved, it's far, far more likely that the universe should be a cold, sterile void, or have collapsed back in on itself, or be full of black holes, than the one we actually find ourselves in, of many galaxies and stars capable of supporting carbon-based life. For instance, if the force of gravity varied from its actual value by just 1 part in 10 to the 60, that's a 1 with 60 zeros after it, then life could not exist. If the force were slightly stronger, then matter would collapse back in on itself. If slightly weaker, then matter would spread out so thinly that no stars, planets or galaxies could form. Another remarkable value is that of the cosmological constant. Our universe is still expanding, and that expansion has to perfectly counteract the force of gravity, which tends to pull the universe back together. The so-called dark energy, posited as the cause of this expansion, remains a very mysterious force. But as physicist Leonard Susskind explained in an edition of Closer to Truth, it turns out that the cosmological constant, which describes the force of dark energy, has to be extremely small and extremely precise.
This is just because for some unknown reason, this constant, whatever made the universe, I hate to say whoever you made the universe. Physicists have a habit of talking in that language, whoever made the universe. They don't really mean it. But whoever made the universe made it with an incredibly small, tiny cosmological constant. It is so small that it is 0.00000. We can sit here for a while. Yeah. 123 of them.
And then a 1.
And then a 1. I think it's actually a 2. Yeah. But it is incredibly small, and nobody really knows why. The one thing that we do know is that if it were very much stronger, it would have blasted apart the galaxies. It would have prevented stars from forming. So you have to understand, galaxies and stars and planets formed because gravity pulled them together in the very early universe. This counteracting anti-gravity could have prevented that, could have prevented the formation of stars, planets, and so forth. So if it were just a little bit bigger than this 0.0000000, it would have prevented our existence. Physicists have never understood why it's so small. And that is the sharpest part of this knife edge.
So, just how much wiggle room is there to this knife edge? Analogies can be helpful here. I've sometimes used the illustration of rolling a set of dice for trillions upon trillions of years before hitting a lucky streak of 76s in a row as an illustration of the incredible odds of these numbers being just right. Stephen Meyer has another analogy.
Just one more riff on that is you got the cosmological constant, which is the degree of fine-tuning of the force that's causing the expansion of the universe. That's accepted at about 1 part in 10 to the 90, I think, is an accepted. And that if that's off, then you get a recollapse of the universe, and no evolution is possible at that point. Or you get a heat death. Okay, if it's off in either direction. And just to put that in perspective, there's 10 to the 80th elementary particles in the universe by many estimates. So getting that the cosmological constant fine-tuning right would be equivalent to the odds of a blindfolded person floating in free space trying to find one marked elementary particle, but having to search not just one universe, not just our universe, but 10 billion our size. So the degree of fine-tuning with some of these parameters is beyond exquisite. We simply don't have modifiers and adjectives to capture this.
But even something as phenomenally fine-tuned as the cosmological constant pales in comparison to a cosmic phenomena referred to as the initial entropy of the universe. John Lennox.
There are even more significant examples given by Roger Penrose, who one of his fine-tuning arguments is that if you want to have a universe with a second law of dynamics, in other words, one in which a car will rust eventually, disorder increases, the creator's aim, and he uses that word, he doesn't believe in a creator, must be accurate to 1 part in 10 to the power 10 to the power 123, which number, as he points out, is so big that if you put a 1 here and a 0 in every elementary particle in the universe, you can't even write it out in decimal basis. So this is a huge thing. It demands explanation. There's a very eminent philosopher here in Oxford. He invited me to be grilled by his students and talk to them about why I believed in God. And he said, I hope you're going to use the best argument against atheism. I said, well, I'll use it if you tell me what it is. Oh, he said, if ever I were to become a Christian, it would be the fine-tuning argument. He said, that really does have bite. And so it's not that I'm sitting here as a Christian saying, look, you guys ought to think about this. They are thinking about it. It's part of standard science now. This is not some peripheral little thing. It is hardcore mainstream science, and it raises a huge question.
I hope you're not feeling too blinded by science and these ridiculously large numbers to still get a sense of why even committed atheists like Hitchens and Dawkins have found the fine-tuning of the universe for life a surprisingly impressive phenomenon. The fact we are here seems, well, miraculous. But as we heard earlier, Hitchens did think there must be some other explanation than God. And there have been some philosophical attempts to explain away the remarkable nature of the fine-tuning of the universe. Some have appealed to the so-called puddle objection of sci-fi writer Douglas Adams. Just as a puddle would be mistaken if it thought that it had precisely the right shape for the water that fills it, so humans aren't the result of a perfectly shaped universe. Just as water adapts to the shape of any hole, so life would just turn up in a different way, adapted to a different set of cosmic constraints. As Jeff Goldblum's character in Jurassic Park puts it,
I'm simply saying that life finds a way.
But the problem with this objection is that life isn't going to find a way in a universe where there is no chemistry to begin with. And as we've been hearing, you need a huge amount of fine-tuning just to get an interesting enough universe for the most basic building blocks of life to be present. So I don't think puddle objections get off the ground. Another objection appeals to the weak anthropic principle. The reasoning runs, look, it's very unremarkable that we find ourselves in a universe fine-tuned for life. After all, it's the only kind of universe in which we can be around to observe. But this rather obvious insight seems to miss the whole point of fine-tuning. The atheist philosopher Stephen Law has criticised this objection, describing it as the equivalent of a blindfolded man standing before a highly trained firing squad. But somehow, every bullet manages to miss him. The man escapes with his life, but rather than wonder whether the miss was deliberately arranged, he shrugs his shoulders and says, "But their all missing is not amazing at all. It's wholly unremarkable. After all, had they not all missed, I wouldn't be here to ponder my luck." That doesn't make any sense, says Law, and I agree. We can't wave off the fine-tuning as inconsequential simply because we're here to observe it. Our existence as observers is the very thing that needs explaining. So what are the best explanations going? Well, here's William Lane Craig helpfully laying out the three main possibilities.
Well, in the contemporary literature on fine-tuning, there are basically three explanatory options. Either physical necessity, that these constants and quantities must have the values they do, that it's not contingent, or secondly, chance, and the form that this normally takes would be a kind of multiverse hypothesis, and then an appeal to an observer selection, self-selection effect, that we can only observe universes that are finely tuned for our existence, so we shouldn't be surprised that somewhere in the infinite multiverse that we should appear in such a universe. And then the third one would be design, that there is an intelligence that has designed the universe.
Craig's first alternative is physical necessity, but scientists have found no reason to believe that the values had to be the way they are. And even if they did, it would still be highly serendipitous that the values happen to coincide with life-permitting conditions. We'll come to Craig's third alternative, the design hypothesis, shortly, but it's the second alternative mentioned that is the most commonly cited natural explanation of fine-tuning, and it's a favourite of sci-fi fans, the multiverse hypothesis. What if our universe is just one of a potentially infinite number of universes, each with its own set of physical laws and parameters? We've won the lottery by being in one that supports life. However, while it makes for enjoyable plot lines in Star Trek, multiverse theory is highly speculative. It's also probably untestable, leading some to question whether it should be treated as a scientific theory at all. John Lennox.
I'm well aware that the way out of it for many scientists, like our astronomer royal, Lord Rees, is to say that there is a multiverse. There are infinitely many universes, and so you'd expect, if that's the case, there to be one like this. But there's no evidence for these universes. And I may be prejudiced, but I was taught quantum physics years ago at Cambridge by Sir John Polkinghorne. And he just says these are not accessible to us. Even on the basis of the principle of economy and explanation, that one universe that has been designed and created by an intelligent creator is infinitely to be preferred to an infinite collection of universes to which we've no access. But I would add that philosophers have been quick to point out that it's not either fine-tuning shows there's a God or there's a multiverse. God can create as many multiverses as he likes, so the multiverse hypothesis does not get rid of God.
Perhaps most problematic to the theory is that the enormous, long-lasting and highly ordered cosmos we find ourselves in is not the sort of universe we would expect to observe if the multiverse exists. Probabilistically, we should expect to find ourselves in a small patch of order in an otherwise disordered cosmos. The fact we don't is a significant strike against multiverse theory. What's more, the proposed mechanism for generating a multiverse would itself need to be exquisitely finely tuned. As Stephen Meyer explained to me, a multiverse would only knock the question back a stage.
Even the attempts to circumvent these theistic arguments based on the beginning in the first place or based on the fine-tuning end up requiring auxiliary hypotheses or alternative hypotheses that themselves end up having tacit theistic implications. Quantum cosmology has a tacit implication that you got the universe coming out of a highly constrained mathematical conceptual apparatus. It implies the need for a mind. The multiverse implies, it takes you right back to the fine-tuning again, so you're right back to the need for a mind to explain things. Even the attempts to get around the theistic arguments have themselves pushed the theistic conclusion to back into the conversation. So I think that's a very interesting thing about the dialectic that is causing this shift to take place sociologically that you so beautifully documented in your book.
Stephen Meyer's very detailed work on the surprising direction of travel in recent years of Big Bang cosmology, fine-tuning, and the origins of life is well expressed in the title of his book, The Return of the God Hypothesis. Like him, I think we are seeing a surprising revival of evidence for that final option left on the table, design, a cosmic mind behind the universe that intended for us to be here. But there's still that nagging question from Christopher Hitchens of whether God should be excluded as an explanation at all. I asked John Lennox.
The natural response may be God is a sort of science stopper as an explanation. I can't investigate God, therefore, I don't want that to be the final explanation. And in any case, the more we do learn about the fine-tuning of the universe, it's likely that we will eventually find some naturalistic explanation. And it's just another God of the gaps argument. God will eventually get squeezed out of this particular argument. I mean, what's your response to that idea that it's just more God of the gaps thinking?
Well, the point is that by discovering the fine-tuning, we are investigating God. We're investigating, the biblical statement, the heavens declare the glory of God. And I made the point earlier, God is the God of the whole show. Henry Ford isn't going to be found in researching the inner workings of a car engine, but you cannot explain its existence without him. What we're dealing with is a complementary approach. We're asking a bigger question. The science gives us the how and part of the why of function. It doesn't give us the ultimate purpose or the ultimate origin. And what these things are doing, like fine-tuning, they're pointing towards something. They're pointing beyond themselves. And what I want to ask is it a reasonable inference to a best explanation to postulate a God who's ultimately responsible for the complexity of this nature, or to postulate mindless impersonal forces? And when I see that the atheistic explanation runs into the sand at the very first hurdle, that is explaining our trust in human intelligence to sort the thing out, then of course I feel that it's much better to go for an explanation that makes sense than one that makes no sense whatsoever.
Like John, I don't believe we need to mistakenly invoke a God of the gaps. In fact, I think some atheists can fall just as easily into a naturalism of the gaps, assuming that everything can be explained by purely natural processes. Instead, I think John Lennox has very helpfully summarised the correct way of treating science and faith. There are, you see, arguably three main ways people have approached this subject. Firstly, conflict. That science and faith are at odds, a view popularised, as we heard in our previous episode, by New Atheism. Evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould popularised another perspective called non-overlapping magisteria, the idea that science and faith are two completely independent realms answering completely separate questions, religion for how to go to heaven, science for how the heavens go. On this view, they should just ignore each other. But I think the real answer is integration, that science informs faith and faith informs science. Not that we can prove God by looking through a telescope or down a microscope, but as Lennox said, we can use our reasoning powers to ask what is the best explanation for all the scientific data we have in front of us. There are at least two options available to us: naturalism or theism. And I think it's perfectly reasonable to say that what we know of our universe does not fit well with Dawkins' naturalistic faith that there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. I think that what we do know of the surprising origins of the universe and its extraordinary architecture fit far better with the concept of a mind beyond it, that imbues it with purpose, meaning and rationality, and which, at bottom, makes all the difference. As we enter the final part of today's show, there's still one important objection we need to address, the one lodged by Richard Dawkins at the very beginning of our episode.
Inventing a big complex thing, which God must be, if he exists, throws a ruddy great spanner in the whole works.
This, in various forms, has been a favourite argument of Richard Dawkins against God. In fact, he dedicated a whole chapter of the God delusion to this pet argument that God cannot be a good explanation, as God must be more complex than the thing being explained. Early on in this series, I introduced Peter Byrom, who told his story of, as a young skeptic, being very influenced by Dawkins and New Atheism, but then discovering some surprisingly good Christian responses.
One of the things that really stood out for me in reading The God Delusion, I mean, it's in all the other New Atheist books as well, but The God Delusion made it very explicit that Dawkins would say, you know, you need to base beliefs on things that have evidence. If it's not evidence-based, it is faith. And faith means believing without evidence or going against the evidence. So I thought, okay, well, if I do go out there and demand evidence for Christianity or God, well, then nobody will be able to provide it. I can be secure in this atheism because there will not be any evidence. But eventually, that's when I discovered people like John Lennox and then especially William Lane Craig, because those were Christian apologists who they actually had evidence and argument. William Lane Craig especially, I think, made a very big impression because he would spell the arguments out very clearly. He'd outline the logic of the arguments and explain very clearly what the evidence was, backing up particular steps. So I actually encountered Christian apologists who were rising to the challenge and offering evidence and argument, and that at least needed factoring in.
Yeah. Peter began to see that the arguments of the new atheists were actually quite shallow, and eventually went on a journey to Christian faith.
I just increasingly had to confront that, look, I actually believe this. And there is good evidence for it. It's not what Dawkins says, which is that it's belief without evidence. Actually, it's trusting what the evidence shows you. The evidence is there that there is a God and that Jesus was raised. You know, there are good rational grounds for it. But the question is, do you then step onto it and trust it, and actually trust it with your life, rather than being like, oh, that's interesting, you know, and kind of keeping it removed. And so that's just the way things were heading.
I now work alongside Peter, and he continues to be a methodical and serious thinker, as well as a rather good impressionist too, I've discovered. Because he has historically spent so much time digging into the arguments of the new atheists, I thought Peter would be the perfect person to bring today's episode into land. So I asked him to bring together his response to Richard Dawkins' complex God objection. And as you'll hear through a wide selection of clips, archive material, and some really solid thinking, he does a great job of comprehensively responding. So, ladies and gentlemen, I give you Peter Byrom.
In The God Delusion, Richard Dawkins devotes the entirety of Chapter 4 to an argument intended to show that God almost certainly does not exist.
The argument from improbability is a very serious argument against the existence of God.
Now, Dawkins is incredibly proud of this argument. He uses it all the time, and he's even described it as devastating.
Complicated things come into the universe late, as a consequence of slow, gradual, incremental steps. God, if he exists, would have to be a very, very, very complicated thing indeed. So to postulate a God as the beginning of the universe, as the answer to the riddle of the first cause, is to shoot yourself in the conceptual foot, because you are immediately postulating something far, far more complicated than that which you are trying to explain.
Now, this argument seemed very credible to me when I first encountered it around 2007, but when I heard the likes of William Lane Craig responding to it, it actually started to look quite problematic.
Let me read to you from Dawkins' book, The Blind Watchmaker, on page 11, how he defines these terms. There he says, and I quote, "A complex object, as opposed to a simple one, has many parts, these parts being of more than one kind." So, in Dawkins' analysis, a simple entity is the one that is composed of the fewest parts of different kinds. Now, when you apply that to God, immediately God comes out as a remarkably simple entity, because as an unembodied mind, God has no parts, much less parts of various kinds.
And of course, then there was the whole saga of Dawkins persistently refusing to debate or engage with William Lane Craig, and that culminated in Craig giving a response lecture to the God Delusion in Dawkins' hometown of Oxford in 2011, and there, Craig responded to Dawkins' arguments from the God Delusion, including this very devastating objection.
Dawkins protests a God capable of continuously monitoring and controlling the individual status of every particle in the universe cannot be simple. Well, this is just confused. Certainly, a mind may have complex ideas, but the mind itself is a remarkably simple, non-physical entity. Dawkins has evidently confused a mind's ideas, which may indeed be complex, with a mind itself, which is an incredibly simple entity, being a non-physical substance which has no parts.
Funnily enough, just 4 months after Dawkins refused to debate William Lane Craig,
Dawkins actually ended up being confronted by this criticism in exactly the same venue that Craig gave the lecture in, Oxford's Sheldonian Theatre. But this time, the challenge was presented to him by the agnostic philosopher Sir Anthony Kenny.
Traditionally, theologians have said that God was simple. That is to say, he had no structure. He was not spread out in space and time. But of course, in saying that he was omnipotent, they said that he had an enormous number of powers, an infinite number of powers. But there is a distinction between complexity of structure and complexity of function. Take my electric razor. It is a much more complicated machine than a cutthroat razor. The cutthroat razor is simple in structure, but it has more complex powers than the electric razor, because the electric razor could only be used to shave a beard, whereas the cutthroat razor could be used to cut a throat.
Indeed, you needn't even have a cutthroat razor. Just find a stone, a flint, and I really don't see what you're saying. I mean, you cannot be serious.
Two senses of simplicity.
Can I have a go?
Yes, please. Yes.
Yes, you three are. You can do best.
Not that I know much about razors.
Now you'll notice that Dawkins there had nothing to say in response at all. He just got incredulous. And sadly, Dawkins went on to actually attack and dismiss Sir Kenny a number of times. He wrote an angry comment on the richarddawkins.net forum where he called Kenny a meddling chairman, and he's made a number of other comments in public events and on film as well.
Certainly my recent encounter with the Archbishop of Canterbury in the Sheldonian Theatre in Oxford, that was completely ruined by the chairman, who was a philosopher and felt it was his role to clarify things, and of course that meant obscuring things.
That was back in 2012, but if you fast forward just over a decade, you will find that Dawkins persists in making the exact same logical mistake. Come August 2023, Dawkins finally ended up in a dialogue situation with Richard Swinburne, the Christian philosopher also from Oxford University. And after hearing Swinburne deliver his case for why God is a simple explanation for the universe, Dawkins just gets stuck on repeat.
Richard Swinburne is saying that God is simple because he's a single entity.
Yeah.
How can he be a single entity if he's simultaneously controlling the universe, every particle in the universe? He's forgiving our sins. He's giving us free will. He's deciding whether or not you'll die or not on a certain day. Such a thing is not a single, simple entity. It's a highly complicated, mammoth, great, big, fat entity.
Well, take another example of a very simple entity, a particle of matter here. This particle of matter is influencing all sorts of other particles of matter all over the universe. How can it do that with just being one particle of matter? Well, it does, according to the law of gravity.
Well, yes, so what? I mean,
well, you were saying that in order to have a large number of effects, it had to be a big thing.
In order to do the things that God is supposed to be doing, he cannot be simple.
Whenever he tries to protest that God is complex, he only ever gives examples of complexity of function, what God is capable of doing, when what he really needs to provide is a case to show how God needs to be composed of an even more complex and thereby even more improbable structure than that of the appearance of design in the universe that he's being invoked to explain. But Dawkins just carries on oblivious of this equivocation. And no matter how Swinburne tries to explain God's simplicity, Dawkins just keeps getting more and more incredulous and going round and round in circles.
Do you think God can read our thoughts? Can he read the thoughts of everyone in this room?
Yes.
All 8 billion people in the world?
Yes.
And he's simple. He's reading all these thoughts, and he's simple. He's not a simple entity. He's reading 8 billion people's thoughts simultaneously.
But that's not the issue at play.
It is the issue. We want a simple explanation, and I'm saying God cannot possibly be a simple explanation. He's a very complex explanation.
What struck me the most watching Dawkins get himself so stuck in this rut over a period of almost 20 years is that his central argument from the God delusion appears to be fundamentally question-begging. If, on the one hand, Dawkins argues consistently and assumes that God has to be constructed out of a complex arrangement of physical parts, because that's allegedly the only way that God can have all his powers, then he's ruling out the very possibility of an unembodied mind from the outset. There cannot be a supernatural designer of the universe, because any designer of the universe would have to be more complex and thereby more improbable than the universe, because there cannot be a supernatural designer of the universe. If, on the other hand, Dawkins doesn't try to argue that God is made out of physical parts, then, at a stretch, his only option is to try to argue that God must be thinking about things that are very, very complex and have lots and lots of parts. But that's where Dawkins' appeal to complexity becomes inconsistent and commits the fallacy of equivocation, confusing two different types of complexity, which creates an ambiguity in the argument.
I have come across theologians who say the beauty of God, I think Richard Swinburne says, God is totally simple.
As we've already heard, he slides from referring to the complexity or simplicity of what God is made out of.
That's the beauty of it. You don't need a complex God. He is simple.
To the complexity of what God can do.
I mean, that's ridiculous, because if he is simple, he couldn't invent the fundamental constants of the laws of physics.
But if that wasn't enough, we finally need to consider perhaps the most crucial point made by another atheist critic, the philosopher Eric Wielenberg, who wrote the following in his analysis of Dawkins' argument in 2009. One reply a theist might make here is that Dawkins has overlooked an important difference between God and natural complex phenomena. Natural phenomena are contingent things, which means they exist but could fail to exist, whereas God exists necessarily. That is, he exists, and it is impossible for him not to exist. If God is a necessary being, then he did not come into existence all at once entirely by chance, because he did not come into existence at all. The central weakness of Dawkins' argument is that it is aimed primarily at proving the non-existence of a being that is unlike the God of traditional monotheism in some important ways. So according to Wielenberg, for all Dawkins knows, those complex thoughts and effects might be the product of a necessary being rather than a contingent being, in which case there's no improbability to God's existence at all. Dawkins is again begging the question, this time by assuming that God must be a contingent being, dependent upon something else outside of himself or more fundamental than himself, like fundamental particles perhaps, to bring about and sustain his existence. And the Christian philosopher Peter S. Williams makes the humorous point, though with a serious edge, that
if Dawkins had written a book called The Contingent God Delusion, he would have sold a lot fewer copies.
If the really big hang-up for Dawkins is this alleged complexity about God, then it's such a needless, non-existent obstacle. If simplicity and elegance is what he's after, what could be more elegant and simple than a divine mind, a purely non-physical mind, at the very beginning, at the very base of the slope of Mount Improbable, with no improbabilities attached to itself, who invents the material universe, and then the whole beautiful, finely tuned, magnificent story of the natural world can just unfold, and Dawkins and everyone else can go for it and study it. It doesn't have to be this big, ugly, complex leap up the cliff face that Dawkins characterizes it as. But I suspect that those equivocations by Dawkins actually give the game away. The big deal for Dawkins doesn't seem to be this issue of God having an inelegant, complex structure that needs this prior evolutionary development. It actually seems to be that Dawkins is more disturbed and troubled by God's complexity of function, as Sir Anthony Kenny called it. He doesn't like the idea of there being a God who creates and acts on and interacts with the universe, let alone there being a God that takes an interest in human affairs and performs miracles. He just seems to prefer that the natural world be left alone and not interfered with. He seems to view God as an intruder, and that doesn't seem like an intellectual issue. It's more of an emotional and personal one. For all that Dawkins talks about logic, reason, and argument, he seems to have settled and entrenched himself on this materialistic presupposition.
You almost sound, Richard, that you would be disappointed ultimately if that was the explanation. You would prefer that there be a sort of Darwinian explanation of the universe itself. That's sort of where your mind goes. You don't like the idea that there's actually is some kind of a mind behind it.
Yeah, that's a fair summary of what I just said.
Peter Byrom with a special report rounding off today's episode of The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. Now, there's a lot more that could be said on Dawkins' big objection to God than even this. In fact, you can access a lengthier mini-feature, Dawkins' Dilemma, by Peter when you become a silver or gold level supporter of the podcast. It's been quite the ride. The beginning of the universe, the fine-tuning that led to you and me, and a deep dive into the question of whether God could be the ultimate cause of it all. We've covered a lot of ground today, but if there's anything I'd like to leave with you as we've explored the mind-boggling progress of cosmology and physics in the past several decades, it's that it turns out the universe is stranger than anyone imagined it possibly could be. The new atheist's bold declaration that science had banished God seems vastly premature. On the contrary, from the surprising discovery that the universe had a beginning to the serendipitous fine-tuning of its fundamental laws for life, I think we're discovering more and more reasons to believe that we're not alone in the cosmos, that there is a mind behind the whole show. Hearing Richard Dawkins' objections to God reminds me of that question asked by many a child too. But if God made the universe, then who made God? But that's sort of the point. If God really is the transcendent cause of the material universe, then God must be the one legitimate exception to that question. The uncaused cause, the first mover, the ground of all being. Choose your metaphor. The point is, whatever God is, he isn't the unwieldy, complex being composed of parts that Richard Dawkins struggles to believe in, as if God were merely some extra-large version of a physical creature. I don't believe in that God either, but I do think it makes perfect sense to believe in a simple, powerful, loving, eternal God who chose to bring you, me, and the whole of physical reality into being. And perhaps, most surprisingly, even chose to step into it in person. You've been listening to The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, telling the story of how new atheism grew old and secular thinkers are considering Christianity again. Material from The Unbelievable Show was used by permission of Premier. Visit premierunbelievable.com for full shows or today's show notes for links to all archive materials used in this episode. And just to remind you, this podcast series is also a book. You can read the first chapter for free when you join my newsletter at justinbrierley.com, where you can also order the book or get a signed copy. Supporting via Patreon or tax-deductible giving from the USA will give you early access to new episodes of the podcast and access to bonus content. So find out more and how to support my efforts to bring thinking faith to the secular and Christian world at justinbrierley.com. The links are with today's show. Coming up next time.
The development from inanimate matter to living matter to the very, very big step of producing a creature capable of reproduction. I have always followed in my philosophical life the principle we must follow the argument wherever it leads.
Why the world's most famous atheist philosopher changed his mind, and we'll meet the growing number of dissident thinkers and scientists discovering the logos behind life. Today's episode was a production of Think Faith in partnership with Genexus and support from the Jerusalem Trust, editing assistance by Isaac Simmons. You can find links to the book and all our featured guests with the show notes. Please subscribe to this podcast, rate and review us, tell others to, share it on social media. It really helps others to find it. Plus, you can get that extended mini feature, Dawkins' Dilemma, and the next episode you just heard a clip from 2 weeks early when you support now at justinbrierley.com. Again, the link is with today's show. See you next time. Thanks for listening today, and to Ellis, who left this review saying, one of the best podcasts I've ever listened to. Historical, insightful, reasoned, and full of heart. So necessary in a culture that has forgotten why it is like it is. Just bought the book too. If you can leave a review, it helps others to discover the show. And if you want to buy the book, like Ellis did, you can get a signed copy from my website. As it happens, gold supporters of this show get signed editions of both my books anyway, plus lots of bonus content and early access. And of course, your support makes a huge difference to me being able to produce this podcast. So for the book or to support, visit justinbrierley.com or follow the links with the show notes.